Greetings and salutations. This is Abe Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth, where we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask an awful lot of questions. You can also visit us at thebittertruth.info, where you can become a bitter pill, spoonful of sugar, or the medicine going down, and get some fabulous swag to make your life better. Listen to the show. And also, if you listen to podcasts at all, Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, all of the usual suspects, we're on everything. And my guest today, Zelda Edmunds, she is the director of Imprisoning a Generation, which is a very powerful documentary on the occupation of Israelis in Palestine, the West Bank specifically. And some of she focuses specifically on 4 kids. I'm going to let her talk. Zelda, how are you?
Doing great. Glad to be joining you.
Hey, I'm glad. This was a fortuitous deal. My life changed in a day. So I'm glad I met you online and everything else, and how we got here. So you're in a festival this Thursday, but it's on Zoom, right?
Yeah, so there's a screening coming up in a couple days here in Austin, Texas, and it's online. And there's another one coming up at the Chicago Palestine Film Festival next month. So if folks want to find out about how to view the film, they can do that at the website imprisoningageneration.com on the upcoming screenings page.
Excellent. And you've been. I went on your link. You've got official selections in a few places, right?
Yeah, the film's been in a handful of film festivals, a lot of community screenings. I'm really thankful that I've gotten to connect with tons of organizations around the world who have used it to educate their communities on what Palestinian children go through under Israeli military detention systems.
And seriously, ahead of time, you let me see the film. Thank you. Powerful shit and heavy. And I mean, like I told you earlier, I saw it in the morning early, and people forget my dad's from there, and he has been back there a long time. I was there like 30 odd years ago, and not to sound facetious, when it was nicer. When I saw some of the clips you had, I was like, God damn, that wasn't like that when 1988. It wasn't like, now it's just, it's just a ruin now. And these people are in a prison. Your film focuses on 4 kids, which powerful stories, each of the 4 of them, but why those 4 kids? How did you end up encountering those kids? What happened?
Yeah. So I got connected to these 4 kids and a few others when I was back in Palestine in 2016. And, I didn't totally know what I was doing when I started making this film. I didn't even go intending to make a film. It happened really unexpectedly. But these stories of kids that were being targeted were just all around. And it was clearly happening more than it was when I had been living there. I lived in the West Bank 2009 to 2011. And of course, this issue of targeting kids is not new. Israel's used this tactic for decades. But it was really clearly increasing from when I had been there before. And so I got connected to these different kids and started trying to document the different ways that they were being targeted. And what became really clear through the process of interviewing them was that they each had been detained or imprisoned at some point, in addition to other forms of targeting and that they were experiencing. And so that's how the film ended up focusing specifically on this aspect of the occupation, which is just the detainment and imprisonment of Palestinians in general, but the film focuses on the way in which that impacts children.
Well, I mean, and to be fair, and in the interest of transparency, you're a young person.
Yep.
You're in your 30s, but when I saw your picture, I thought, Jesus Christ, she's 11 years old. How the fuck did she make this movie? This movie was made by a whiskey-soaked middle-aged bald guy. This movie was not made by someone like you. But how did you end up in the West Bank, 2009, 2011? What got you living there? What happened?
I was first volunteering in a school. This was just right after I got out of university, and then I ended up just staying longer than expected. Once you get to know folks and get to know what's going on, it's hard to look away. It's hard to turn away from that. So I ended up getting involved in different organizational projects and things happening on the ground. And it really built the foundation for what's become a lot of my work over the last decade.
Now, when you did you meet these kids personally, or were they introduced to you by activists, or how did that work out?
Yep. So through predominantly through one organization I was connected to, but you meet folks and then they're like, oh, you got to talk to my nephew, you got to talk to my cousin, you just kind of end up getting connected to more and more people. So a lot of it was just kind of through building relationships with folks.
And your documentary makes the point that the Israelis arrest like 500 to 700 kids a year.
Yeah.
So kids, not Hezbollah, not Hamas, not suicide bombers, fucking like the kids in this movie, 10, 12, 15 years old. What is their justification? I mean, you had a part in the story where Nuran, this girl who's just a fucking badass. I mean, I would have folded. That girl had balls, and God bless her older brother for teaching her what he taught her. But when that captain guy, was doing the whole, like, I'm John Lennon bullshit, right? Trying to, like, do you know who I am kind of a thing. And she didn't even flinch. That girl's 14 when she got arrested, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Nuran is an incredibly strong, now young woman. At the time she was 14 when she was arrested, 15 when I interviewed her. And yeah, she was fortunate to have, fortunate might not be the right word, but we'll use that for now, to have brothers that really helped sort of prepare her, knowing that, the chances of getting arrested, if you're at all vocal about the occupation, like, that is a very real reality.
Absolutely. For
so many people. And so they really kind of help prepare her for, like, this is what you need to do if you get arrested and you get interrogated, like, these are the things you need to know.
Right.
And so she sort of went into that experience somewhat prepared in ways, I think kids should be prepared for going into, a military interrogation. But yeah, she had that support of her brothers, and they both ended up in prison as well, both of her brothers at the same time as her. And they were actually, they went on hunger strike for, I think it was over 70 days that Wow. They were actually on hunger strikes, and it was a successful hunger strike. They survived and their demands were met. But yeah.
Well, so like, so I was back there in 88. Okay. I was there in 88, first Intifada, and I wasn't there for the Intifada. I had to do some family shit, and big, long story. Oslo happened a few years later, and a lot of people were like, oh yeah, Oslo, blah, blah, blah. But I'd been back there. So I wasn't really crazy about the idea because, the deals that the PA made, the Palestinian Authority, were not favorable to a Palestinian, first of all, a two-state solution, which is a joke now, especially, but to any sort of right of return, human rights. It just intensified the occupation and intensified the Israeli, I don't know, scrutiny. What do you want to call it? Just the patrols, just random arrests. It got worse, but in your documentary, you make the point when you say that in Hebron, for example, that there's illegal settlements. And I know what you're going to say, but you're the person who was back there recently. Can you define the illegal settlements that we're talking about? Because you're talking about the A, B, and C, which I think came from the Oslo Accords. Can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the Oslo Accords, the quote unquote peace processes that took place in the early 90s under Clinton's administration, it really set in motion the continuation of what we're seeing right now, right? Even with the quote unquote deal of the century with Trump. But the West Bank is split into areas A, B, and C. And it was intended to be a temporary structure that has, like the rest of the occupation, just become a permanent annexation. But the West Bank is split into Area A, which is under Palestinian administrative control, as well as sort of day-to-day stuff. Area B, which is under Israeli security, and Palestinian Authority has some control. And then Area C, which is entirely under Israeli control. And 60% of the West Bank is Area C, right? And so a majority of the West Bank, Palestinian Authority has absolutely no control. But then Area B and C also is, constantly under all kinds of stuff in regards to Israeli policies. And so it's sort of just, when we talk about this apartheid state, it blows my mind that people, not everyone, regardless of where you fall politically, can look at this situation and see it as anything but an apartheid state.
100%.
It's literally the definition of apartheid. It's segregation based on race and ethnicity.
Right.
And so, and when we talk about a Palestinian state, what state are we talking about, right? Area A under Palestinian control in the West Bank is these little pockets, literally, I think, I forget where it's at right now, but for sure over 100 pockets of Palestinian land, or Palestinian controlled land, quote unquote, that are separated by checkpoints, Israeli only roads, you name it. And so it's absurd, really. It's people talk about it as like a Swiss cheese map, because you look at it and it's literally these small little pockets. So that's how the West Bank is split up. And then Hebron is actually a different situation where now there's over 200 illegal Israeli settlements across the West Bank, which are all in Area C. But then Hebron is kind of a different situation where there's actually an Israeli settlement in the middle, 4 Israeli settlements in the middle of a Palestinian center. And at any given time, there are it's hard to know exactly, but somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 soldiers present in this area. And the occupation in Hebron is just, Palestinians can't walk out in certain parts of Hebron. Palestinians can't walk out their door without facing a checkpoint.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, really quick. So when you say illegal settlements, define that, because some people, when I say illegal settlements, they'll toss out bullshit terms like you're being anti-Semitic, whatever. So when you say illegal settlements, define that.
Yeah. So under international law, these settlements are considered illegal because this is land that is occupied by another body. And it's under international law, it's illegal for citizens of the occupying power to be living within the occupied land. I fall in I don't believe any human is illegal. So I don't, I try and talk about the settlements are illegal. The people themselves are not illegal, but the settlements are illegal. And Israelis are subsidized to move to these illegal settlements.
Yes, they are.
So it's the Israeli government at large, this is a part of their plan to continue to annex, to colonize Palestinian land, and to slowly, I really see it as a slow, at times not slow, but right now sometimes it feels slow attempt of genocide against Palestinians.
Oh, sorry.
Ethnic cleansing.
Well, they're doing a goddamn good job, because I read the statistic about 6 months ago, because I popped off with something online and some guy challenged me, so I went and looked it up. Since the mid-30s, the British-backed Jews and then later Israel have killed over 2 million Palestinians in the last 70-odd years, which, not quite the Hitler numbers or the Stalin numbers, but for people who didn't do anything wrong, because they're not all, trying to blow up your kids, right? So, and so to, kind of speak to your point really quick, like the challenge I had when I was back there, and, I didn't want to go. I had to go. I didn't want to go. Within a couple of weeks, I was like, I don't blame these people for picking up a fucking gun. I'm pretty much detached from my dad's side of the family, whatever. But on a human level, you cannot not empathize, right? I see what my cousins go through on a daily basis. And this was back then, before there were checkpoints, before there were gates. You could drive into Jerusalem from Ramallah during the general strikes, during the curfews, right? So if Ramallah was open from 10 to 12, and then Jerusalem was open from 2 to 4, and Bethlehem was open from 4 to 6, you could go there without a lot of hassle. Now, like, especially what I saw in your film, and especially what I saw, the destruction and the ruin wrought by the Israelis, and not, like you said, no one's illegal, and I don't want to hate on human beings as a whole. You're taught what you're taught. But as a quick side note, I remember when I was taking my cousin's dead body back from Jordan into the West Bank. This is how I ended up there, because my dad talked me into this shit. And there was this kid from New Jersey, soldier, white guy. And he saw me, had long hair and black overcoat and glasses. I look like an MTV extra. And he goes, "Hey, man, you American?" I'm like, yeah. He saw my passport, right? And he goes, "Yeah, I'm from New Jersey." So there's this Israeli talking to me, the American kid. And this is 100% fucking true. He's like, "Dude, I've been here 3 years, man." We start talking about rock and roll and music. Last show he saw was Springsteen in about 84 in New Jersey. How old am I? And so I'm telling him the last show I saw, which was only a couple of months prior, and so we're notching back. He played bass, and I was a drummer. Like, we're just talking, and neither one of us gave a fuck about this situation. We were just two human guys talking about art and music and whatever. And all of a sudden, his little sergeant guy comes, taps him on the shoulder. My cousin, who's, born in just outside of Ramallah, came to the United States when he was about 20. So he taps me on the shoulder. "Hey, man, you can't do that shit." And we get kind of dragged away from each other. And this is while they're searching my cousin's body for contraband. They're cutting him open, making sure he's not got plastic explosives, because we came from Oman with a dead body, blah, 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 blah. So all of that to say, I get there, and it's like 3 weeks of this shit where you're like, forced to take your shoes off and all of this. So when I saw your documentary and I saw some of the stuff happening to some of these kids and some of the stuff that I saw there, it brought back a lot of memories, not stuff that I'd completely forgotten, because I pretty much never stopped really talking about this stuff. But this is stuff that people don't know. And so why I'm kind of excited about having you on and talking about your movie is that a lot of Americans, for example, when they say, "Oh, well, they should just get along, this is centuries old," it's not centuries old, right? Yeah. This is pretty much a recent construct, because last I checked, the Arabs, Iran has more Jews outside of Israel than anywhere in the world, except for the United States. In the Middle East, Iran is number 2. They don't torture Jews. They don't put them in refugee camps. They don't take their property. In Iran, they got Jewish delis. They got synagogues. They live. They're totally cool. If they were torturing Jews in Iran, we would nuke Iran right now. Right? And so when people tell me this shit, it's almost out of a willful ignorance. Like, what was your experience coming back, having made this movie and talking to Americans and telling you, "Oh, well, they're just monsters. They just want to destroy Israel"?
I think something I always try and just hold at the center in all of this work is just the humanity of it. There's so much dehumanization that takes place, but also like, I just want to remember the humanity. And while what's going on, the modern day Israel and the occupation, which is barely, over 70 years old since the Nakba, the catastrophe in which Zionist forces moved in and began displacing Palestinians in large numbers. The trauma and the wounds of Jews and of Arabs, but let's talk about Jews for a minute, of Jewish people around the world, that is old, right? Anti-Semitism is a real thing in our world. It's been for a long time. It continues to be. It's on an uptick right now. And I think it's no coincidence that what we see going on in Palestine by the Israeli government, and oftentimes civilians as well, it's no coincidence that a lot of it looks really similar to the kinds of oppression and the kinds of abuse and the kinds of torture and the kinds of killings that have happened against Jews for a long time. Mm-hmm. Because the wounds of our world, they perpetuate. Mm-hmm. And so I think that I always try and sort of base it in that, like the liberation of Palestine, of Palestinians, would be liberating for Jews, Israelis, folks around the world, right? Like, we forget sometimes that, you know, just how wrapped up one another's liberation is in those around us. And so I try and base it in that when I talk to folks, and not everyone accepts that, not everyone likes that, but I think it's important to sort of look at this as trauma and wounds that are being perpetuated out of trauma and wounds.
And I agree with you to a large part. The only problem I have, the only contention I would have with that is that we've conflated, where I say we, the West has conflated two atrocities, right? The Holocaust was awful and happened. So to any right-wingers listening to this show that think it didn't happen, fuck you, it happened. But the Middle East was not responsible for the pogroms, right? That was a European construct that happened directly after the Crusades, when King Richard did not want to pay Jewish bankers back for the money he borrowed for the Crusades to go steal gold from a bunch of Muslims. So it gets back to, we had this one awful catastrophe and then justified it by creating another catastrophe.
Yeah.
And where you have literally, where the right-wing Israelis love the word fascist without a sense of irony whatsoever. Like, you know, they use that word like it's okay because we're protecting ourselves. Well, that makes you a theocracy. You're not a democracy. Yeah. Like they like to pitch in the West. Oh, they're the best democracy in the Middle East. Really, they're as democratic. In fact, Iran is more democratic than Israel. And that's a fucking fact, because Iran does not have an apartheid. Iran does not take Jews and put them in a place and cut them off from food and medicine and calories, right? So where does this fetish come from? And you've done this more than I have. So where does this fetish come from? That we got to defend Israel at all costs, even though they sell our military secrets to the Chinese, and we seem to be okay with it because they're God's chosen people. By the way, a third of Palestinians are Christian, and I don't know any of them that think that the Jews are God's chosen people currently. So where does that all come from?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I don't know if my answer is going to be any better than yours.
Well, it's a conversations.
It is. Yeah. You know, I think that what's going on in Palestine is beneficial to the U.S. powers that be and international powers that be. Sure. Like there's a lot of money being made by the occupation.
Oh, hell yeah. Oh, hell yeah.
And you know, this system of oppression that is horrific for Palestinians, unimaginably horrific, but is also like tearing apart, like just so many families. And it's backed by the US completely, right? And so many people are benefiting off of this and tearing, you know, people who actually are both Semitic, right? Jews and Palestinians are all Semitic, right?
Thank you.
It really is this, you know, these international, I would argue, white supremacist powers that are getting a lot out of keeping this situation what it is.
Well, listen, on kind of a side note, not off topic necessarily, but you had a lot of closed circuit television in your documentary. And how did you get that? Because a lot of that stuff is just like, I've never seen that in my life.
The footage?
Yeah, you had some CCTV stuff where, like, you know, the one kid was accused of he was shot and then he was accused of having a knife, and then you could see he had no knife, and then suddenly he had a knife, in the report or whatever. It's like you had a lot of CCTV stuff that, like, how did you get that? Or
So,
if you can talk about it, because I don't want to get you in trouble.
Totally, I would love to. So that's actually not CCTV. That's organizations on the ground that are documenting this stuff all the time, because it's happening outside their houses, their homes, in their neighborhood, right? So for example, that footage you're talking about of a settler. So often, what happens often is Palestinians will be killed, and then a knife suddenly appears next to their body as a sort of a justification for, like, oh, it was in self-defense, right? And so that particular footage you're referring to, where you see a settler like who has just shot this Palestinian who's lying dead on the ground, and the settler with his gun is walking backwards, and the soldier comes and drops a knife next to the body, right? And so it's rare to actually get footage like that, but when this is happening right outside your home, some people are able to do that, and it's really dangerous for Palestinians to document what's going on.
Oh, I'll bet, yeah, absolutely.
And yet people do it because they know that if this story doesn't get out, if people around the world don't know what's going on, then nothing will change for the better. And that's what we've seen for 72 years now, right? Like it is like you're saying, when you were there in 88, to now, it's just so much worse even from that time. So, so I was really fortunate to get different pieces of footage from different organizations that are really supportive of this story being told, and making sure that this information is out there in as accessible ways as possible. Well,
and you made a point about a settler. There was this one cat you had on the film. I swear to Christ, I'm like, there's so many of these American guys, right? They can't get laid in New Jersey, and they get the brochure. It's like, milk and honey and whatever fuck biblical promise they were made. That one fat guy's like, remember my face. I'm like, okay, Rambo.
Yeah.
Okay. And without a gun, I'd kick your fucking ass. But continue. I'm sorry.
Well, one of the things I think it's important to mention about that footage, right? So it's the settler in Hebron that's a clip from International Solidarity Movement.
Okay.
And so that was a settler in Hebron, U.S. accent, right? Straight out of New Jersey.
Straight out of Brooklyn. Fuck yeah.
And behind him is another American with a Patriots hat on, right? And it's like,
yes.
And he's saying, like, I will come and hunt you down and I will kill you, essentially, is what, he says, I'll be the last face you see on this earth, right? And it's like, wow, just the extra, and like, that's not every settler, right? There's settlers that span the whole sort of, political realm.
But really, though, if you're a settler, it's kind of like being a mellow Nazi. Seriously, let's just call it. Yeah, like being a settler is actively participating in the colonization of Palestine. A little bit, right?
No doubt. There's no way around that. But like we were saying, there are settlers who move to the West Bank because they're subsidized by the Israeli government. So it's economically beneficial for them. But then on the other end of the spectrum are settlers that are extremely extreme. Settlers that harass and kill Palestinians, without being held accountable, like that. That is essentially at all. There's very rare cases where, Israelis will actually get prosecuted, at all, and then to the point of getting any kind of a sentence. And I'm not a fan of prisons in any context, but we got to talk about the reality that, Palestinians are the conviction rate of Palestinians is I believe somewhere above 99%.
Dude, Palestinians get convicted in that area like a black guy in the 30s for stealing a loaf of bread. Seriously, it's that bad. You made a couple of points in your documentary, especially on the ID situation, which was more complicated than I understood it to be. Right. So when I hear shit like, well, they have rights, and you might have heard this story. We had a Palestinian Supreme Court judge. Okay. So for one time, for 9 months as an interim guy, before they appointed another guy, They had one Palestinian for 9 months as a Supreme Court judge in Israel. And the rest of the time, it's multiple IDs, depending on the whim of the soldier. And you had more IDs than I was even aware existed. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. And it's even more complex than what I show in the film. That's even sort of a simplified version. But basically, there's, again, part of the apartheid structure of the Israeli, political system. So there's different forms of identification that people have depending on their race and ethnicity. So there's Israeli citizens, right? And within that, though, it's broken down by ethnicity, or religion, if you're Jewish, or if you're Arab, I guess, so ethnicity. And there's over 50 laws that actually discriminate against Palestinians, aka like Arabs, with Israeli citizenship. So they all have citizenship, right, in this particular category, but you actually have different access depending on your ethnicity within that.
Right.
So then you get into, there's also Jerusalem IDs, which are Palestinians that live in East Jerusalem that are not considered citizens, even though technically they live on the Israeli side of the wall, but they're living in what is supposed to be Palestinian East Jerusalem, right? But they're living in Israeli-controlled Israeli side of the wall. And they don't have a right to vote in Israeli elections. They also have to apply for permits to go through checkpoints.
All right.
I'm sorry. It's a little complicated. So, like in the film, let me use one of the stories.
You had that one kid, the shoddy guy, whose mother had to apply all the time practically. But continue.
Yeah, totally. So Shadi, one of the kids in the film, while he was being held in Israel, in Israeli detention, for almost 3 years, starting at the age of 12, his mom has a West Bank ID, which I haven't even gotten to that aspect of identifications yet, but we'll do that in a minute. So his mom has a West Bank ID and his dad has a Jerusalem ID. So he was actually, in his whole process was not under Israeli military detention system. He was actually prosecuted under civilian law rather than military law,
right,
which you would never even know because it looks exactly the same as West Bank, prosecution under military detention. In practice, even though on paper he technically has more rights, but his experience of interrogation, the abuse he went through, and the process of prosecution looked very similar. Okay, so this gets super complicated. My head gets fuzzy around it just trying to explain it, which is why I wanted to put it into the film in a visual way, because it's like, let's look at this.
Well, no, it works in a simplistic way, but I mean, but you make a point though that Palestinian, even kids, are tried under military law, not Israeli civilian law, right?
Yes. So so let's talk about the West Bank and Gaza IDs then. So the last sort of primary identification is a West Bank ID or a Gaza ID. If you have a West Bank ID, you have to apply for a permit in order to access other parts of Israel, Jerusalem, and so forth. Only some people get that. Only some of the time. Like, for example, often the best chance of it will be like around Christmas for Christians or around Ramadan for Muslims, but it totally depends on what's going on. It's totally subjugated to all these other things that can change at any point. And if you have any political history, you'll never be granted access to a permit and you're stuck in the West Bank. So now Gaza, folks who live in Gaza, it's essentially an open air prison. Right. Access in and out of Gaza is extremely limited. There's exceptions for if you have a medical condition, but even then, I don't know the up-to-date stats on that, but even then it's a crapshoot. A lot of people don't get that. I want to say it's somewhere in like the half mark of people who might be dying of cancer, for example, actually get access to get to Jerusalem to get the medical attention they need and so forth. It's essentially an open air prison that almost 2 million Palestinians live in, 85% of which are refugees, right? And so people hear Gaza and they think of, oh my God, these terrorists, who live in Gaza, because that's what we get in the media.
And to clarify really quickly, you're saying it in the Arabic, but it's Gaza to the people who don't know what you're saying.
Thanks. Yeah, Gaza. Thank you.
Continue. Continue.
Yeah. So, I think that like part of the work we have to do in the US is just to break this down, and help people understand when we talk about military occupation, what does that mean? Because most people have no idea.
None.
And you're working in an uphill battle constantly because they already have so many perceptions by everything they get in the media. A lot of things they'll get from community. Just the rhetoric around Palestine and Israel is so coded, and so often, like, even in spaces that are dedicated to social justice work, often there will be this coded language when it comes to Palestinians. It just falls short of saying, yeah, we believe in human rights for everyone.
But
when it comes to Palestinians, it is often an exception.
Yeah.
Whether they know it or not. It's these little things that come through from the media and the language and things we talk about. And then people have no idea what's actually going on. So that's what we have to do, is we have to break it down for people in digestible ways. And that's what I was trying to do with this film, was to show aspects of that through these kids' stories. So I'll just say that basically the film looks at the experience of detention and or imprisonment that each of these kids go through. But then it also looks at these different aspects of the occupation, in particular, to sort of get a slightly bigger picture of where this particular aspect of the occupation fits into the bigger picture of repression against Palestinians.
Well, and let me ask you really quick, because as we wrap up, so the issue also, people don't like to admit that Israel is an imperialist colonial construct, 100%. It's a white deal. How do I know this? Because Iraqi Jews, Iranian Jews, Ethiopian Jews, in fact, about a month and a half ago, a bunch of Ethiopian Jews just got deported for jack all. No idea why, right? But I thought they had a right to return. Well, they committed crimes. So white Israelis don't commit crimes. The Ukrainian Ashkenazis don't commit crimes. Israel seems to be no different than where we are in the U.S. right now, with their own people, with people that are supposed to have a right to return. So when you, for example, you're to the point you're making, that people think, oh, it's coded, they don't get it. It seems to be, to me, here in this country, we don't understand that Israel does run a more racist regime than we do here, more akin to South Africa. Is that wrong? Or because I don't see that. I know some Iraqi Jews. I know some Iranian Jews with family there who were there for a while, came in when they were kids. It wasn't really nice, They finally had to go. They had to jump through some major hoops. Where if you're coming in from Romania or Italy, it's a different beach.
Yeah, I think looking at what's going on in Palestine, like comparing that to the U.S. it's really important to do because, we're on colonized land here. I'm currently on Wampanoag land in what is considered Massachusetts. And, it's the systems of oppression against Black and Brown people in this country. There are so many parallels. And there's very distinct differences as well. But it all comes back to these same systems of racism and colonization that are so deeply rooted. I think that the extremity of what's going on in Palestine is more than in the U.S. in some ways, but it also just looks really different. It's when you look at I have a good friend, Keith Lamar, who is wrongfully on death row in Ohio because he is a Black man who was tried by an all-white jury, and tons of evidence was withheld in the process. Like, that's pretty similar, to like the ways in which, and so, these same systems are at play here. And we need to make those connections. We need to make those ties. We need to fight against prisons and these systems that are intended to target folks of color, at their core. Like, they both in Palestine and in the US, the prison industrial complex goes back to these ways in which to control non-white folks. And we need to be making those ties and those connections.
Well, I mean, as we wrap up, Zelda, I have to say again, thank you for making this film.
Thank you so much.
And I look forward to more work from you. And I'm sure you got stuff in the works and you're planning on other projects. I'll have your link to the movie in the body of the show. But what's the link they can reach right now to see your film Thursday? Because you're on the Zoom festival.
Yeah, so the best thing to do would be to go to imprisoningageneration.com.
Okay,
and there's an upcoming screenings page, and there you can see information.
Awesome.
of both the one coming up on Thursday, and if people are listening to this down the line, you can see whatever is coming up. So
excellent.
Thank you so much for spending the time to have this conversation.
No, I appreciate your generosity. And guys, as we wrap up, my guest has been Zelda Edmunds. She is the director of Imprisoning a Generation. The film is all over the place. You have to see it. It's not long. I think she did it on purpose for your attention span because it's only 50 minutes. I could have watched it for 2 hours. It was amazing. But again, guys, thebittertruth.info, and you can go there, check the previous shows and the blogs and everything else. And if this stuff makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to, sleep tight.